Greetings and welcome to the pilot episode of STEM Squared, a podcast that explores the relationship between science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and education and learning. My name is Dr. Michael Hammond-Todd. I'm a science educator and STEM researcher, and I am welcoming you from the traditional First Nations territories of the Shivets in southwestern Utah and the Sunamuth on Vancouver Island. And in this pilot podcast, we are going to be looking at the title of this podcast, STEM Squared. What does that mean? And so in the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about the idea of STEM Squared and sharing some news related to STEM education in North America today. And we're going to be looking at NASA's Artemis 1 project. But first, let's look into STEM Squared. What is it? The idea of STEM Squared emerged in my own work as a science educator and researcher. Oftentimes in education, there is a gap between the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics and educational processes and practice. And so in my own work as an educator and a professional who works with veteran and future teachers, I wanted to come up with a framework that encouraged educators to think about STEM within more holistic and inclusive processes. More specifically, we were interested in finding ways to connect STEM to society, to better explore the conceptual transformations that occur in STEM, and to be exceptionally and multiculturally inclusive. And so this idea of STEM Square emerged in my own educational practice in both the United States and Canada. However, before getting into the model of STEM Squared in more significant detail, it's important to be aware of the history of STEM education itself. And there have always been efforts on behalf of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics educators to connect their curricula to society. And if you look at the emergence of STEM as an educational field, you see its origins in earlier movements. Glenn Eichenhead writes about the science, technology, and society connections in the late 80s and early 90s, and it has been explored by many other scholars as well. Well, the STS and STSE, Science, Technology, Society, and Environmental Education, continue to be important models in parts of the United States and Canada. STEM would increasingly dominate over the past few decades. STEM itself started from an earlier variation by the National Science Foundation called SMET, Science, Math, Engineering, and Technology, and was later changed to STEM by Dr. Ramaleh, who was the NSF Director of Education in the NSF at that time. While STEM itself as a model for education emerged during the early phase of No Child Left Behind, many researchers have talked about the challenges of STEM learning to meeting the needs of at-risk and diverse populations. And so in my own education, I came to realize that one of the ways that we can make STEM education more effective is to think about the fields of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, within educational contexts. And in this first series, over the next few episodes, we're going to be talking about that model, but I will briefly introduce it here. If you go into the STEM Squared website or use our YouTube video, which has a video of this podcast, you'll notice that the title sequence has STEM squared in brackets with an exponential 2. And on the top of STEM squared, you see the traditional fields of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. On the bottom, you see the educational areas that the STEM squared model is focused on integrating into STEM education, and that is connections to society, transformative learning, and exceptional and multicultural inclusion. And so in the next podcast, we're going to be talking about the first, which is the connection between STEM and society. But first, we are going to wrap up this pilot episode of STEM Squared with a little bit of science news. In addition to our discussion on the relationship between STEM and education, STEM Squared will be providing you with educational news, interviews, and reviews of STEM curricula that may be of interest for both students and educators. And in this first podcast, we wanted to talk about the NASA Artemis 1 program. Now, the link to the Artemis 1 project is included in the description for this pilot podcast. And basically, the Artemis 1 project is a program by NASA that is going to be allowing scientists and astronauts from many different countries to explore the moon, with the goal of putting a new crew of astronauts on the moon in the next 2 years. And so in the next few podcasts, we'll be talking about the Artemis 1 project and the educational resources that you can find related to teaching and learning. But first, in this podcast, we just wanted to point you to the site. Feel free to check it out. It has live updates of launches. The Artemis 1 project will be a 6-week window where the spacecraft is performing maneuvers before the manned flights in 2024. In addition to news and aircraft updates, you can find educational curricula for at both the primary and secondary levels. And so I would encourage you to check out NASA's Artemis 1 project. Hello and welcome back to the final segment in our pilot episode. Just wanted to give our listeners an overview of the future of STEM Squared. The goal of this podcast series, again, is to explore the relationship between STEM and education in a brisk 10 minutes, as we know both students and educators have limited time. And so, in our second episode, we're going to be looking at the S in STEM Squared, which explores the connection between STEM education and society. And I will see you there. Now, if you have any questions about this episode or need to get in touch, our email is stemsquared@gmail.com, or you can contact me via the STEM Squared website. Let me know if you have any questions about our podcast today, and get out there and enjoy STEM and learning.